There has been much lately about the relationship between this president and the press, the media. And David Bodney, First Amendment lawyer, is joining us to talk about some of those issues. The Twitter handle is @BodSpeak. David, welcome. Thanks for being on POTUS today.
Thank you, Tim. Good morning.
Are we in unprecedented times first, do you think?
I think so. Nothing like this has ever happened at the White House. I think in the history of covering administrations of both parties.
I wonder if there is a challenge in trying to put it in historical context because the nature of the media today is so different than it was even 10, 15 years ago.
It is different, and that's a point I think that several members of the Supreme Court noted at oral argument yesterday in a First Amendment case. Social media, Twitter, Facebook, provide opportunities to communicate unlike anything we saw in the classic town square. But nevertheless, we rely on certain bedrock First Amendment principles to function in a democracy. And this administration seems unaccustomed to dealing with those bedrock principles.
And speaking of principles, is fake news protected speech?
What is fake news?
Well, if we were to take, let me define it first, as I think most people, rather than just saying it's news that I don't like, let me say that fake news typically is somebody puts up a website, intentionally writes something just to attract attention, make money, and then doesn't care about whether it's true or not, just puts it up there so that they get a lot of hits.
That's not necessarily protected speech under our Constitution, no. And it really depends what the quote-unquote speaker does. Mm-hmm. If the speaker violates the trademark interests of a legitimate news organization, if it violates the copyright interests of a legacy news organization, or for that matter, anyone, there could very well be problems with an attempt to use the First Amendment as cover for violative conduct.
And I don't want to necessarily go down the hypothetical rabbit hole, but if we were to talk about, for example, the fake news story that people heard about a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C., where there was supposedly some sort of a sex ring, trafficking ring that was being run out of the basement, and the Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was somehow involved in this. And if the way it is stated is speculating and presenting as theoretical, I would guess that that's rumor mongering, but that is still protected speech.
It really does depend on what they say and what they do. Parody is absolutely protected under our Constitution. Satire is absolutely protected, according to the Supreme Court in the Falwell decision. And so the rabbit hole takes us down into a series of questions about whether this stuff qualifies as satire or parody, or whether these are knowingly false statements. A knowing falsehood isn't something that is protected under the Constitution.
David Bodney with his First Amendment lawyer. I wonder, David, is there a change now in the way the president is treated under the law because he is president? I think back to threats of lawsuits by President Trump when he was candidate Trump. Does his now becoming president change the way that he is treated under the law?
Well, he is certainly a public official, whereas before he was a public figure. I think in both instances, the New York Times versus Sullivan doctrine applies, and therefore if he wants to sue a media organization for libel, he still has to meet the actual malice test. He has to prove that the statement was made knowing it was false or with reckless disregard for the truth, and he must prove that with convincing clarity. That's kind of the legal notion. As a practical matter, I think as President of the United States, he becomes far more open to criticism and comment by us all.
David, is there a legal, and I don't mean to sound quibbly here or even snide or anything, is there a legal definition of truth?
I'm not aware of a legal definition of truth.
Or a fact, because when fact checkers check facts, people say, well, there are certain parts of that statement that are open to interpretation, and this seems to me to be the nature of law anyway. I mean, I had an interview with Justice Breyer one time. He said you add a word to a law or a statute, and that word can be interpreted many ways, so there are a lot of different ways it can go. But I guess, so what I'm wondering is when we try to say legal or illegal with facts and truth, where does the law take us?
Well, it takes us again down into a discussion of bedrock principles. Truth is something we believe to be objectively verifiable. It is empirically verifiable. It is knowable. And before it becomes a kind of Socratic dialogue or a philosophical discussion, it's something that juries deal with every day, courts deal with all the time, journalists deal with constantly. It's not that complicated. Mm-hmm. But it seems this administration has gone out of its way to turn the world upside down and to question legitimate reporting, true statements, and call them fake, and then pronounce falsehoods from a public podium as if they were true. And I think we all ought to have enough faith in the democratic process to know that the people are not going to be fooled by that sort of thing.
To that point, is there anything illegal about banning press from events? In other words, either from press briefings or press conferences. And I wonder if there is any law that requires access.
Yeah, it's a good question, and under the First Amendment, folks have the right to speak. As Justice Ginsburg said yesterday, they also have the right to receive information. Reporters have the right to ask questions. But I'm not aware of a law that says a public official has to answer the question or allow a certain member to ask a question over another. But it does become more complicated when a public official decides to ban certain news organizations from traditional fora as a means of retribution. When organizations like CNN, the New York Times, the LA Times, Politico, BuzzFeed are banned from a gaggle, a press briefing, but Breitbart and the Washington Times and One American News Network are invited. How was that decision made, and what are its consequences? So, as a legal matter, there are precious few cases that address the issue. There have been some, and there have been some decisions from lower courts that say selective access can violate the constitutional rights of a news organization, but they are very fact-dependent, and those cases are few and far between.
Interesting perspective. It's obviously a debate that is an ongoing one and has been since the beginning of our democracy.
Right.
We will continue this debate. David Bodney, thanks so much for being on today.
Thank you, Tim. My pleasure.
David Bodney is a First Amendment lawyer joining us to have that discussion about where the press is and this administration. He tweets at Bodspeak, at BODSPEAK.